moving on to the second content block, which is looking at inflation. So inflation, we're looking at the percent. What is inflation? It is the percentage change in the general price of general level of prices, the prices of goods and services, measured by the CPI, also known as the Consumer Price Index. So it must be maintained to achieve price stability. Okay? So it's really important that we do understand that concept and we do go through it. So inflation may be a term that you've been hearing a lot recently. So hopefully this will sort of reaffirm your understanding of what it is. So the CPI, what is that? CPI is looking at Consumer Price Index. It is the average level of prices of the goods and services that are typical household buys. So it's a basket of goods and services that typically most households will buy. For example, petrol. It is measured through changes in the price of selected household items, weighted according to significance, monitored by the ABS. So CPI figure for inflation is released every 3 months. The CPI index, so Consumer Price Index, rose 1.4% in the March quarter and 7% annually, according to the latest data from the ABS. So sometimes petrol won't be included in the CPI, sometimes it will, just depends on what CPI basket you're looking at. But household items as well, like groceries, things like that, are all included. Inflation rate is the current CPI minus the previous CPI divided by previous CPI, and then you want to times by 100 to get the percentage rate. So this is a formula that you need to know for your exam. So I would highly recommend that you do memorize that one. Righto, next up we have headline inflation. So actual inflation rate, but it may include one-off events that distort the figures. For example, GST being introduced. Okay? So underlying inflation, what is that? That is a more accurate measure of inflation because it removes the effects of one-off events that distort the entire figure, can change the whole figure even though it's just one small thing that probably won't happen every time, like the introduction of GST. So underlying inflation tends to be more accurate in that way. So if you're ever asked which one is more accurate or why is underlying more accurate, then you have your response. RBA has a target framework for the inflation rate of between 2 to 3% since 1993. So as a nation, we are required to hit out the target on average over the economic cycle. So here's an example of a CPI calculation. So base period 2017 and our current period, which is 2018. So previous, current, right? Think back to the formula. So we've got 5 kilo of oranges at 80 cents, and then expenditure $4, and then let's say 120 and expenditure $6. 6 haircuts at $11, and then goes up by $1.50, and 100 bus rides at $1.40, and then we've got them at $1.50. Okay, so it goes up by 10 cents. So total expenditure for it adds up to 210, and over here adds up to 231. What is the CPI? Well, we get the current year minus the previous year divided by the previous year of 210, and then we times it by 100 to get the percentage of 10%. Okay? So hopefully that is making sense, but yeah, that is literally like how you would do a calculation like that. You probably won't be given this much information. Like, I guess you won't be like told all of these specific things. You'll just be told the total expenditure for previous, current, but this is like an example to help you understand as well. Okay, moving on. Causes of inflation. So demand pull inflation is the first type. This is where there's excess demand compared to supply, which causes shortages and prices to rise in the short term. Okay, so we've got a lot of demand compared to supply, which causes a lot of like shortages, things like that, and price increases. Okay, so think back to like toilet paper during COVID. A lot of people were demanding toilet paper, so the price of toilet paper actually ended up going up. Demand curve shifts to the right, so there's an increase in the demand, What is the cause of this? Any type of growth in aggregate demand can be higher levels of consumer spending and investment, maybe due to higher confidence. So people are more likely to buy luxury or designer items when they have more money to spend and they're confident in the economy and they don't feel like they need to save their money in case something goes wrong. Income increases, similar concept. Tax cuts, which means you have more money that you would normally be giving away in tax in your pocket, and falling interest rates as well. So it's cheaper to borrow and to spend, therefore. Cost push inflation. So increased production costs causes firms to raise prices to cover these costs. Okay? So it's very important to take that into consideration. This idea that the business is passing on the cost that they have accumulated to the cost of the product for the consumer. So let's think about it. Let's say I own a business where I sell cakes. So I make the cakes and then I sell the cake. So let's say I make a cake and the price of milk has gone up by a few dollars, like let's say $2. Like let's say before the milk I was getting it for $3 and now I'm getting it for $5. So instead of just accepting that and then having to cut back on how much profit I get, I'm going to pass on that $2 rise in the price onto my cake. So if I'm normally selling my cake for $40, I will now sell it for $42 or $43 to account for that cost, that increase in cost. So therefore, when a consumer comes to buy the cake, they're now paying more because the general price of the good has increased. And so that is inflation. So that is what cost push inflation is. So supply curve shifts to the left and there's a decrease in supply, also known as aggregate supply. Okay, so the causes increased in cost of production. So if costs of production such as wages, rent, supplies, other inputs, etc. increase, right? So it could even be rent. So let's say I have hired out like a shop for my cake business and the rent has gone up by $15. I may just pass that on to the product. Same thing with wages. So if there's a minimum wage increase, then the business will maybe pass on that rise onto the consumers, so they don't have to pay for it. So then they are generally passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices, which causes inflation. So yeah, hopefully that is all making sense. Next up, we've got imported inflation. So, if imported prices increase, perhaps caused by a fall in the price of the Australian dollar, then Australia pays higher prices for goods and services, and this flows through the official inflation rate. Right? So, essentially, this idea that now goods are more expensive overseas. Then Australia pays, like, let's say I'm buying a shirt from, I don't know, like Italy or something, and the price has gone up because the Australian dollar has fallen, then I will have to pay more because the euro is worth more. Then that's still inflation because I, as an Australian consumer, am still paying more for that good because there's been a general increase in the price of goods and services, or in this case, a good, which then passes on to the inflation rate figure, the official inflation rate figure. So yeah, hopefully that's making sense with imported inflation. Next up, we have inflationary expectations. So if consumers expect prices to rise, then they may increase their spending while the price is lower. Okay? So this is kind of similar to demand pull inflation, where there's an increase in demand. So if employees start demanding higher wages due to the expected price rises, the cost for employers will increase and this will cause cost push inflation. So what do I mean here? So basically they're saying that if they realize that inflation's increasing and say, oh my god, I should buy toilet paper because everybody's buying it, I feel like they're going to up the prices in a few weeks, I'm going to go and buy 10 rolls of toilet paper right now. So that's probably, think of people during COVID, that was probably them, right? And then this idea that if I as an employee go to my employer and say, hey look, wages are everything is more expensive, I think I should get a higher wage, right? So then if I go to my employer and say that, then if my employer decides, okay, you can get a higher wage, then that's a cost for my employer, right? Because then they have to pass that on to the products. So let's say that I'm employed at a cake shop, and then I tell my boss, hey, look, I think everything's increasing, everything's becoming more expensive, so I think I should get a higher wage to compensate for this. And if they agree, then they will also have to pass on that cost to the consumer. Okay. So then the cake will be more expensive for the consumer. And what is that? It is the general rise in the price of goods and services, which is inflation. So, what is the positive effect of inflation? There's really not much other than the fact that it reduces deflation, which is a fall in spending. So, borrowing as consumers wait for lower prices. So, that can cause a downturn. But yeah, other than that, there's really no other advantages associated with inflation. Next up, loss in purchasing power. So, lower wages, like real income, nominal inflation rate, and living standards, things like that, um, can all be impacted in that case. So that's how you can get a lower or a loss in purchasing power. So you're not able to purchase as much as you once used to be able to with that amount of money. Higher unemployment, so producers may reduce the workforce to cut costs, right? So higher unemployment may occur. Lower exports, so reduced international competitiveness can be a negative impact of high inflation. Value of savings decreases as well. So if interest rates do not keep pace with the inflation, then we see the value of savings decreasing. Increased inequality, so impacts most on lower income earners. Wage price inflationary spiral. So this is where wage increases lead to higher prices, like we just talked about with that cake shop example, which leads to higher wage demands. Okay, so if wages increase, they lead to higher prices. I say, oh my god, everything's so expensive, can you please increase my wage? And then, like, again, it's just like a process that keeps on going round and round and round in circles, which is why it's called a wage price inflationary spiral, because it keeps spiraling around. Okay, constrain economic growth. So this is due to contractionary policy. So it's really essential to understand what that involves. So obviously, when we have high inflation, it's going to cause a bit of issues in terms of contracting the economy. Resource misallocation is another negative effect of high inflation. This idea that investment is speculative on short term assets, which may increase due to higher returns. So they divert invest. Right, so here's like a sort of summary of some of the negative impacts. So you have loss in purchasing power, you have higher unemployment, you have lower exports, the value of savings decreases, okay, increased inequality, which tends to mainly impact like lower income earners who don't have as much. Anyway, wage price inflationary spiral, constraining economic growth, and resource misallocation. So you can see the comparison of positive versus negative. So that's why they are always trying to keep the inflation rate targeted, and they're trying to target at 2 to 3%.